Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Bustamante. In this video 7.9, we're going to talk about phylogeny. Basically, how do we look at evolutionary evidence in different ways and put that information together and try and explain evolutionary relationships into these things called phylogenetic trees or cladograms. So systematics is basically what we use in order to do this idea that biology is systematic. We have quantitative science that uses traits of living and fossil organisms to infer relationships among organisms over time. Basically, when we look at all these things and these traits, what do they have in common? How are they different? And what does that mean about how they might be related to one another? Taxonomy is a branch of systematic biology that identifies names and organizes biodiversity into categories. You probably studied this somewhere along the lines in middle school. Well, you talk about a domain. A domain is the biggest kind of grouping, includes the most or the least specific groupings of commonalities. And then you would talk about kingdoms, get a little bit more specific. Phyla, even more specific, classes, orders, families, and then how most of the time we refer to animals or other living organisms as their genus and then their species, right? And their species is that thing that is most specific, has the least in common with things other over here in the domain, oftentimes means that they can breed together as well. So just this idea that we can look at commonalities and we can group them more specifically, right? Here's our orca whale. We could go through our kingdom, phyla, class, order, family, genus, and species to get down to kind of how we refer to the orca whale generally. So classification is just the process of naming and assigning organisms or groups taxons, right? Putting them into these orders and figuring out what their names are based on their relationships. Today's systematics tries to group organisms into natural groups based on their evolutionary paths. And we do this by something called a phylogenetic tree or phylogeny. This is an example of a phylogenetic tree here. It's just trying to group things that are more alike. They end up being closer together, you might say, or having a more closer common ancestor than things that are farther away. Basically, it's just a way of kind of making guesses to try and organize how species might have common ancestors or how long ago they might have had a common ancestor from each other. Generally, it's very, very long time ago. Now we can use DNA technology to see into the past and kind of help identify how some traits have probably evolved over time and place them correctly into this idea of the tree of life, right? How does everything sort of relate to each other? For a long time, we didn't have this DNA evidence, and instead we used analogous and homologous structures to make guesses about how they were put together, and even fossils, right? Where do we find these fossils? When? How do they maybe relate to each other? So when we start to put all this information together, we create what's called a phylogeny, a model that explains an evolutionary relationship between organisms. These are predictions, okay? It says phylogenetic predictions because they're just like hypotheses. Do we know this for certain? No, we don't. So how are phylogenists, people who study this, coming up with these phylogenetic trees? Well, they're looking at genetic similarities. Now we have DNA evidence that helps us understand how they're related. We're looking at anatomical similarities. What are the structures in their physiology that might have relations? And then transitional fossils. Are there fossil evidence, or is there fossil evidence that allows us to maybe see a connection between two species? Maybe this is the link that we miss. And as we get more and more transitional fossils, we can get a better idea about how things might relate. We then take all that information, we put it together in what's called a phylogenetic tree. It's constructed of traits that are shared by and unique to the taxon of their common ancestor. So if we look at this phylogenetic tree over here on the right, the common ancestor is all the way down here at the bottom of the thing that they all have in common, and they branch out from there. Sometimes we'll see these called cladograms. It's a diagram that shows evolutionary relationships among groups. based on their phylogeny. Clades study these. Technically, phylogenetic trees and cladograms have a little bit of differences in them and how they're constructed. But really, for us in this class, we pretty much say they're the same thing because we're going to use them in the same way. So when we see a new characteristic or trait that evolves in our tree, we're going to have branches. And that branches comes from something called a node. And that node is going to tell us the most recent common ancestor or shared ancestor. This is the population, was the last time organisms shared a common ancestor. Okay, remember, it's not single individuals we're looking at here. We're looking at whole populations of when things branched off from one another. So when I look at this first one with the green circle, right, anytime you kind of see a branching part, that's a node or a node or a node or a node or a node. All of those are nodes where you see it look kind of like a fork. Why might we see a node come about? Well, maybe there's some sort of physical isolation where species had to evolve and change based on their environment, and they changed so much, right, that they became a new species. There was some sort of genetic isolation that they could no longer mate. Something generally happens so that these there's something that causes this speciation, this idea. Closer nodes, therefore, are more closely related, right? So if you're looking maybe on the right here, these would be more closely related to things way over on the left. And then we need to know clades. Clades are a group of species that has descended from a common ancestor. So this green part, this is a clade. So think about, we could cut it off and this whole group would move together, but it shows that it's a common ancestor. Here's our common ancestor. So this group here is a clade. This single line here is actually a clade, right? I could cut it off, and here is the common ancestor node. However, if I look at this one in red, this is not a clade because the common ancestor is not in here. It's way down here where you would see that common ancestor. And this is not actually a clade over here in orange, basically because I left off this one other part. If I took everything else off, it would be a clade. We can have a root that would show us our most common ancestor for all. These ones that look sort of like this, they're more rooted. But you could also see them unrooted. So here are 3 examples of phylogenetic trees, and you could see any of them look like this on the AP test, and actually all 3 of these down here show the same phylogenetic relationships. We have AB closely related, AB closest related, AB closest related. We also have C and D and C and D and C and D, and they're all more closely related to each other than they are to E or to E or to E. So really we can turn these, we can twist them, we can take them and make them into different shapes so that they look a little different, but they all are showing us the same cladogram of phylogenetic tree. One way to think about it is you can actually rotate it around a node, and that can be a good way to try and think about it. Like if you rotate this in a different way, does it actually change the relationships? Like if I changed B and A here, that wouldn't change my phylogenetic tree. They would be the same. So what is this information used for? Ancestral characteristics, those that are found with an entire line of a descent or group of organisms. Derived characteristics, those that are present in members of one group of the line but don't necessarily have a common ancestor. And now, right, we can talk about, we can even use DNA or segments of DNA to help us come up with this. I want to emphasize these are hypotheses, right? We don't know these for certain. Things can change in our evolutionary history, and in fact they often do, specifically as we gain more evidence.